My name is Margaret, but everyone calls me Maggie. My husband, Henry, and I lived in our old wooden house, isolated in the deep woods of Willow Creek, a small forgotten town in the interior of the state of Maine, in the United States. We were old, both in our 70s. We lived a quiet life, almost frozen in time. Fresh bread for breakfast, an old radio playing songs that no one listens to anymore, and long, silent afternoons in front of the fireplace. Our only company, besides each other, was Buddy, our dog, an old, clumsy golden retriever, but sweet as honey. That October afternoon, the sky was heavy, covered in low, gray clouds. The wind blew in a strange way. It didn't howl or roar. It whispered. And there was something about it that made me uneasy, as if it were trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew, when Henry, sitting by the window with his book, murmured, "Is Buddy back yet?" I didn't worry. He often went out exploring in the woods. He always came back with dirt and leaves stuck to his face. Then I heard the screen door creak. Softly, slowly, as if someone had gently pushed it open. "Buddy," I called, not looking. But something wasn't right. I turned and there he was, standing in the doorway. Wet, covered in mud, his fur matted, but still, completely still. "Buddy," I repeated, my voice a little weaker. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark. He didn't run up to me, like he did every day. He just stood there, his eyes pitch black, looking at me in a way my dog had never looked at me before. That's when I knew that wasn't Buddy. Henry rose slowly from his chair, his eyes narrowed toward the door. "Is that Buddy?" he asked, his voice a little hoarse. "I think so," I answered, but my words came out hesitantly, disconnected from my certainty. The dog, or what seemed to be him, entered the room without making a sound. His paws made no sound on the wooden floor, as if he were weightless, as if he were gliding instead of walking. Henry crouched down with effort, his joints creaking, and reached for Buddy's nose. "Hey, Buddy, where have you been?" I was going to warn him. Something inside me screamed at him not to touch him, but my mouth went dry and all I could do was watch. Buddy didn't move. He just stared intently at Henry with those eyes that now seemed dead. There was no light, no recognition. It was like looking into a bottomless pit. When Henry touched his head, Buddy finally reacted, but not in the way I expected. 1 second he flinched. The next he jumped back with an agility he'd never had before, growling low. But the sound wasn't exactly a growl, it was more wrong. It was like hearing a human trying to imitate an animal. Henry backed away, startled. "What the hell?" Buddy took a step forward, but his paws were shaking. Like his body was struggling to hold its shape. Like something inside him was trying to get out. His bones cracked loud, audible, grotesque. It was then that I noticed the dark drool dripping from his mouth. Black as ink, thick, staining the floor. "Henry," I screamed, my hand trembling over my mouth. "That's not our dog." He looked at me, and for a moment our eyes locked with the same question. What did we let into our house? Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. And then they went out. The last thing we saw was the reflection of Buddy's eyes, or whatever possessed him, glowing in the dark like embers. The house was pitch black. I knew every corner of that home, every creak in the floor, every thread of the curtain. But suddenly, everything seemed strange, cold, as if the house was breathing on its own, as if it were waking up with him. "Henry?" I whispered. Silence. The most absolute silence I had ever experienced. Not the sound of the wind, not the ticking of the living room clock, not even the sound of our breathing. We were suspended inside something, as if time had stopped considering us alive. I reached for the flashlight in the drawer with trembling hands. The light was dim, but it revealed enough. Buddy was gone, but not alone. On the floor, where he had been seconds before, there were marks. Footprints. But they weren't dog paws. They were fingers. Long, deep, sinking into the wood. Like disfigured hands dragging something heavy. Henry stood, panting, leaning against the wall. His eyes were wide. "That wasn't our dog, Maggie," he said finally. I saw something in his eyes, like a face, trapped inside. I froze. I took a deep breath and said what I didn't want to say. "I think he's been possessed." The word hung between us like smoke. It was ridiculous. It was absurd, but everything inside me told me it was true. And then, from down the hall, came a voice. Maggie, my name. But it wasn't Henry. It wasn't a man's voice, or a woman's voice. It was like several mouths speaking together, from deep in the earth, muffled by the wood, like it was echoing beneath the house. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice cracking. Henry just nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark hallway. The flashlight began to flicker, and then something pulled me. Not physically, but mentally. An invisible force was dragging me to the old mirror at the end of the hallway, a legacy from my mother, who always told me never to look at it in the dark. I walked, unwillingly, as if my feet were no longer my own. The mirror was covered in dust, but my reflection was clean, too clean, and that was when I saw it. Behind me, in the reflection, was Buddy. His eyes were like coal, and his mouth was wide open, much wider than his anatomy would allow. And written on the wall behind him, in something dark and dripping, why you called him. The letters formed themselves, as if an invisible hand were writing at that very moment. I spun on my heels, shining the flashlight. Nothing. But the air had changed. It was thick, heavy, and the smell was of wet earth, like a freshly dug grave. Back in the mirror, my reflection no longer followed me. He looked at me. He smiled. And whispered he's still here. After what I saw in the mirror, I couldn't sleep anymore. Neither could Henry. We sat in the kitchen with the flashlight between us, the radio off, the soup forgotten on the stove. The clock had stopped at 7:16. That was exactly when Buddy walked in the door. The mirror was covered with an old sheet. But even so, I could still see him. That reflection that wasn't mine. Those eyes of Buddy, or whatever lived inside him, burning in the shadows of the house. It was the next morning, after a sleepless night, and no sleep, that things began to make sense. Rummaging through an old drawer, I found something I'd forgotten about for years, a book. Small, with a worn leather cover. No title. I'd bought it at a flea market on a trip to Arizona, when we were still young. The old man who sold it to me said it was a guide to dealing with the invisible. I thought it was beautiful, folksy. I'd never taken it seriously. But now, every symbol, every page, seemed to scream at me. In the section marked with a faded piece of cloth, there was a chapter, Transformed Spirits, when the animal is no longer the animal. It was all their dead eyes, strange behavior, dark drool, and the call. Some spirits, when accidentally summoned, seek out weak bodies to inhabit. Dogs are easy targets, for they have pure souls and a deep connection to humans. When this happens, the animal is not destroyed, just erased. Locked inside. In the margin of the page, handwritten, was a note, a ritual of return may free it. But the spirit will not leave without a fight. The ritual required 3 things. 1. The root of a tree that had already died standing. 2. The blood of the guardian, the one who made the call. 3. A drum made of skin beaten into the rhythm of the heart. I knew where to find the tree. There was an old, dry oak tree still standing on the hill behind the house. The blood would be mine. And the drum, well, I improvised with an old pot and a cloth stretched over it. It was crude, but the book said the power was in the sound, not the instrument. That night I set up the circle in the backyard, under a full moon that tore through the clouds like an open eye in the sky. Henry stayed inside. He wanted to be there, but I wouldn't let him. This was mine. I had made it. I called him. Maybe when I wrote an old poem from the book, laughing. Maybe when I lit candles on the equinox, just for the aesthetics. I don't know, but something heard. Something responded. I placed the root in the center of the circle. I wet my fingers with my blood, and drew the symbols on the ground, as the book indicated. And then I started beating the drum. Slow rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. And he came. Buddy emerged from the forest like a shadow on legs. He limped now, as if the spirit within him was struggling to hold his body together. His eyes narrowed, almost as if the real Buddy were inside, trying to escape. As he crossed the circle, the air exploded. A rotten smell of burning flesh filled the room. The creature writhed. It howled, but it wasn't the howl of a dog. It was the sound of 1,000 voices screaming in pain, in rage, in hunger. I began to recite the words from the book. Natina 2LOKK, let go of what isn't yours. Natina 2LOKK, take back what was. The dog lunged at me. It bit my arm. It tore at the flesh. I felt the pain rise like a wave, but I kept beating the drum, even as blood ran down my face. Natina 2LOKK let go of what isn't yours, the wind roared. The trees bent. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Buddy fell to his side, panting, his eyes closed. And the silence returned. Real silence this time. I crawled over to him, my arm throbbing, and put my hand on his chest. His heart was beating. Weakly, but beating. He was there. Seriously. When I went back inside, Henry looked at me with tears in his eyes. He's back. I nodded. And you? I lost something. But what I got back is worth more. Buddy was still weak. He limped. Sometimes he looked in the mirror as if remembering what he'd seen inside. But now his eyes were clear. He was ours again. But I knew. Something was still lurking in the woods, waiting for another open door, another oversight, another call. The night may have silenced the screams, but that which was called still wanders in the shadows, waiting for the next door to open. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like. It helps us continue bringing terror to your screen. Subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss the next chapters, rituals, and whispers from beyond. And of course, if you know someone who would dare enter these forests with Maggie, share this video with them, because the real horror is forgetting to warn others. Until the next call, and be careful with the mirrors tonight.